I mentioned earlier this morning that one of our main objectives for the summit was to expand our sort of view of health to include social determinants of health and other sector determinants of health, which are becoming increasingly relevant, obviously, in the context of climate change. So we talked about WASH, and we talked about, we'll talk about mental health tomorrow, but maybe nothing is sort of farther afield from our normal conventional core global health subjects than agriculture and food systems. So I was particularly interested in putting this panel together and hearing from the experts that we'll hear from now and learning a little bit more about the subject. I think, it's easy sort of conceptually to imagine, but food systems sit right at the intersection really of climate and the environment and human health. And it really kind of makes that whole continuum full circle. So obviously a super critical topic for us to cover, and looking forward to this discussion. So first, for some Firestarter remarks, I want to introduce Oliver Camp. Oliver is an environment and food systems advocacy advisor for the Global Alliance for Improved Nutrition. Most of us have probably heard about GAIN. He works in a dozen countries, and he focuses on integrated approaches to nutrition and climate, including through the Initiative on Climate Action and Nutrition, or ICAN. So, Oliver, come on up.
I'm so delighted that this event is happening and that this session on food systems is taking place. I'm conscious this is the last session before we can all go to the reception or some dinner in Baku. So I'm just going to make 4 points in the opening remarks, and then we can go to the panel. And the first point is that food systems are so often the elephant in the room, and they go slightly forgotten, somehow slip through the cracks when we're talking about climate or when we're talking about health. Often health conversations are dominated by kind of health sector interventions, health sector thinking, and likewise climate conversations might look at agriculture, but they don't necessarily look at nutrition outcomes. And somehow by falling between these two stools, we end up not really covering nutrition, health, and food systems holistically. So hopefully today we can put paid to that. The second point, and this is probably the biggest point, I mean, food systems today are in a really dire state, and things are unfortunately likely to get worse, but I promise I'll be more optimistic after this pessimistic opening. So, impact on the environment, we heard a bit about this from Marina Romanello and from Jonathan Peltz earlier, but food systems are responsible for 1/3 of greenhouse gas emissions and also a huge proportion of fresh water use, deforestation, biodiversity loss, and we have big issues around this, like food loss and waste, which adds a huge burden on the environment as well. And as we heard, food systems are also extremely vulnerable to the effects of climate change. And that's not only the physical effects on the food system, but it also is the knock-on effects on nutrition. So just to explore that a little bit, we are very likely to see significant reduction in yields over the next decades, years and decades. We're likely to see a reduced micronutrient content in crops. This is a really interesting area that needs a presentation of its own. But as plants grow more greenery, actually the nutritional content of the edible portion of plants goes down, so we have less nutrition from the food we're producing. We have livestock losses, we have crop losses associated with extreme weather events, with droughts, with extreme heat. And as we heard earlier, we have socioeconomic issues, like the fact that agricultural workers won't be able to work the land, and therefore that'll contribute again to lower food production and lower food access. And all of this is then adding to an already pretty atrocious situation in terms of nutrition. Many of you will know that 735 million people go to bed hungry every day. That's already an outrage in itself. But just thinking about micronutrient deficiencies in addition to that, about 3 billion people in the world can't afford a healthy diet because of various issues around access, affordability, what's being produced, and the economic dynamics of food systems. And as a result of that, between 3 and 4 billion people have at least one micronutrient deficiency. And I find that just an extraordinary statistic, that almost half of the world's population probably has at least one micronutrient deficiency. Just to round that out, on the other side of this equation, you have non-communicable diseases, obesity, overweight, diabetes, which are all increasing. many of those illnesses can actually coexist. So you have undernutrition and overnutrition, or those issues of NCDs, in the same populations, even the same individuals. So it's a really, really negative picture, and I'm sorry to focus on the negative first. So those are the things we need to overcome. It's that lack of dietary diversity, it's improved access to nutritious diets, and it's strengthening the food systems which are responsible for providing those diets. Of course, on the other hand, we also need to reduce the bad, and I'm sure many of you here think about things like ultra-processed foods and the excessive consumption of foods that are doing us more harm than good. So we'll come on to all of this in the panel, but let me just highlight my final 2 points. So, third point, we think that these climate and health links give us huge opportunities to find better integration and co-benefits. That initiative that Kelly mentioned, the Initiative on Climate Action and Nutrition, which I'm representing with my notebook today, that really speaks the language of improved coherence. It was a COP27 initiative launched by the government of Egypt, co-chaired with us at GAIN, FAO, WHO, SUN, UN Nutrition are all our partners. And the underlying premise is that if we take more coordinated, more coherent, more synergistic action on climate and health together, we can achieve so much more than when we work on these two things in isolation. So it really looks at how climate policies, strategies, programs, financing can be more nutrition sensitive, and vice versa, how nutrition policy strategies and programming and financing can be more climate sensitive. We did some baselining work last year and basically found at the moment there isn't much integration. If you look at, say, an NDC, the climate policy document, only about 2% of NDCs currently talk about nutrition and really sort of commit to take action on nutrition. And likewise, when you look at finance, only a tiny, tiny proportion, sort of 3% of climate finance, looks at nutrition outcomes. And you can say the same sort of thing when you look at nutrition policies and strategies. They aren't sufficiently taking action on climate. So that's bad news, but of course it's also a big opportunity. And opportunity is really where I want to leave off in these opening remarks before we go to the panel. So my fourth point is that by pure good luck, there are a whole host of interventions available to us which do connect climate and health outcomes through nutrition. And it basically breaks down into 3 areas. On the production side, what we can do in the value chain, and on the consumption side. So just very, very quickly, on the production side, what are we producing and how? Are we thinking about producing foods that are good for both environmental outcomes and nutritional outcomes? Are we producing foods that are appropriate to local agroclimatic conditions? Are we actually thinking about those effects, not only on economic development outcomes, but also on human health and planetary health? In the value chain, we currently waste 30–40% of the food that we produce, but we can do so much if we look at the processing, the packaging, the transport, logistics, infrastructure around food, storage, of course, cold chains. And by addressing that food that is lost and wasted, we are improving nutritional outcomes. More nutrition is available to people in the places where they need it the most. And also, we are avoiding that massive waste of resources that goes into wasted food, but also we're avoiding the methane emissions associated with rotting food, effectively. And then the final point is on shifting diets, and I think both at an individual level and also at an institutional level, this is a big opportunity. It has to be context specific, it has to be led by the local circumstances, but overall, as we heard earlier from Jonathan Peltz, we are consuming the wrong things. We are consuming too much of the food that makes us unwell and that has a negative impact on the environment. And by every means possible, we need to think about at an individual level and at an institutional level through workforce nutrition programs, through school feeding programs, through public procurement. What are the things that we can do to shift consumption and to slowly move us towards a more sustainable, more nutritious and healthier diet? So I think I'm going to leave off there so that we can explore these topics more in the panel. And Kelly, I guess back to you. Thanks very much.
I'll just ask the other panelists to come on up as I introduce them. Amy Ickowitz is a senior scientist in the governance, equity, and well-being at CIFOR-ICRAF, which is the Center for International Forestry Research and World Agroforestry. Welcome, Amy. Taylor is the executive director of Tailored Foods. He's a food anthropologist, I like that, and a social entrepreneur. And I took a note that he runs ultra marathons because I think that's impressive. And I hope that we're joined online by Carol Zavaleta-Cortijo. Yes, we are. Hi, Carol. Carol is a researcher at the, are you ready for my Spanish? Which is only slightly better than my Azerbaijani. Universidad Peruana, Cayetano, Heredia. And she's also with the Indigenous Peoples Observatory Network. She's a medical doctor and a PhD economist, and sorry, not a PhD, PhD in health geography. So welcome, Taylor, Amy, Carol, Oliver, thank you for those remarks. There's a lot there, right? That was a number of points, and I'm sure we could spend hours and days, and many of you probably do spend days dissecting those issues and thinking about some of the major, yes, you mentioned the challenges, but from my sort of lay perspective in this area, the solutions to get over those hurdles seem really daunting, actually. And so I'm just going to pick up on one piece of what you've said, and I'm going to start with you, Amy, and ask you this question. So one thing we heard from Oliver is that, well, I mean, there were some scary statistics about the future, meaning a declining content of micronutrients in our diet, and in part because of an increasingly less diverse array of food sources. So the homogenization of diet worldwide. Can you, from your research, help us understand the significance of that, both from an environmental perspective and on our health, and what has your research found in that area?
I can try to start answering that question. Yes, you're right. Currently, 48% of global calories consumed come just from 3 crops: rice, wheat, and maize. And over 90% of calories come from only 15 crops. So yes, there has been a major homogenization of global diets. And not only are we producing very few foods globally, but the foods that we are producing are not necessarily the best ones to solve all of our nutritional problems. So as Oliver said, it's true that there are millions of people who don't have enough food to eat, but there are many more people who have poor quality diets who are suffering from micronutrient deficiencies. And maize, rice, and wheat are excellent at providing calories, but they are not very good at providing micronutrients. So we need to transform the global food system to produce foods that are also nutrient dense. And so those tend to be fruits, vegetables, pulses, nuts. Those are the foods that are more micronutrient dense, and they're currently underproduced in the global food system. So there are only 40 countries in the world that have enough supply of fruits and vegetables to meet dietary recommendations, and those are the 2 food groups for which there are clear dietary recommendations. So with nuts, for example, there is not a clear dietary recommendation, but we definitely don't produce enough nuts for global health. So we've heard all throughout the day that there are climate change issues with food production, and that's true. So we need to find a way to produce these nutrient-rich foods, but we also need to find a way to do it in a climate-positive way. So that seems daunting. There is one part of a solution, though, is something that kind of seems obvious once you think about it, but often gets overlooked, and that is food trees. So over 50% of cultivated fruits come from trees. All nuts come from trees. Peanuts don't count as technical nuts. And so tree planting that we hear of as a solution for climate change, for sequestering carbon, are also possible to help solve some of our nutrition challenges. So that's on the one hand, on the more active things that we could do, but I also wanted to connect back to some of the earlier themes that came out of some of the talks today. So I wrote down some notes that resonated with me. So somebody mentioned in one of the films that prevention is better than a cure. Loss avoidance was also mentioned. Nature-based solutions were also mentioned. And so that theme is sometimes a little less sexy because it's not something that we can actively do, but it might be almost as important, if not more important, in helping to address some of the challenges. So the solution that I'm going to present is one that you've all talked about or heard about in relation to climate change, and that's conserving forests. They're important for mitigating climate change emissions, but they are also, people sometimes in the international community also talk about their importance for biodiversity conservation, but their impact on food is often either overlooked or sometimes forests are even seen as antagonistic to food production because it's seen as a rival towards agriculture for land. But forests are also really important for food and nutrition in many places in the world. Not in every place in the world, but in many places in the world where I work in the tropics. Forests are actually part of the solution to food and nutrition problems, especially when it comes to micronutrient issues. The most obvious way is through wild foods. Now, that seems to a lot of people when they first encounter this idea, something kind of marginal, maybe that applies to some remote communities that use wild foods, but that it can't be that important for large blocks of population. But actually, we've done a few studies, so coming back to your first question about our work, we've done a few studies that actually show that it's not just a marginal contribution. So we did a study in Zambia, the first ever nationally representative survey of wild food collection and consumption with the Zambia Statistics Agency and the Zambian Forestry Department. And we found that 90% of households actually collect wild foods, in rural households, in Zambia. And that 68% collect wild fruits, 73% collect wild vegetables, and if you take the median consumption of just those food groups, it ends up being almost half of World Health recommendations for fruit and vegetable consumption. So that's not a marginal contribution. That's pretty center, but it gets overlooked because we don't often, like I said, that's the first nationally representative survey. Usually there are just a few case studies here and there. So that's one example. Another example that might not seem obvious to people are the contributions of mangrove forests. So we did a study in Indonesia with over 100,000 observations and found that coastal households that live near healthy, high-dense mangroves consume 28% more fish and other aquatic animals than other coastal households. So again, that might not seem so obvious, but the numbers are real and fairly large. In a smaller study in the Congo Basin, we found that 78% of animal source foods consumed by children under the age of 5 come from wild meat and freshwater riverine fish that are also dependent on forests. So this is an important phenomenon that often gets overlooked. And so I just want to say that oftentimes when we think and we see forests as presented as, well, we'd like to conserve forests, they're nice for climate change, they're nice for biodiversity, but unfortunately we can't because we need to feed our people. You hear that sometimes from national policymakers. But what often happens is that forests get cut to produce those 3 cereals, maize, wheat, and rice, that maybe provide calories, but they're losing all the rich micronutrient-dense foods that come from the forests. I think I'll end there, but I have some more to say if you want to come back to about the indirect benefits of forests for food consumption.
Thanks. Yeah, I'm sure you do have more to say on this subject, and you touched on so many fascinating things. One thing, just right off the bat from the beginning, not only are agro-product concentrated in 3 products, but there are 3 grains, but they're not particularly the best 3. I don't know if that means that if we only had 3 and they were broccoli, papaya, and peanuts or something, that would be any better. So I think it's a little bit of both, right? It's the lack of diversity, but it's also that concentration in a pretty not a strong micronutrient product. And you mentioned about the conserving forestry and the fact that is underappreciated in policy discussions. But just a follow-up question there, how does the yield compare in, I don't know if it's hectares and acreage or the amount of input needed to produce the foods that those, but I mean, is it comparable? So do large swaths of forest, of healthy forest or mangroves produce anything close to the amount of nutrients and calories as commercial agriculture?
Definitely not calories. That's pretty certain. But to answer your question, we don't have the data to know. It isn't something that's been surveyed as of now. It's something that we're trying to get at indirectly through remote sensing in our work, but we haven't gotten there yet. But the other thing is that it's not so simple because there's a huge diversity of foods from forests. So depends on the type of forest and the specific system. Even within Zambia, the types of foods collected in different regions vary dramatically. In our survey, we only looked at the top 5 in a few food groups across the regions. And even with that, we had over 300 forest foods for which there is not a lot of data on their nutrient composition.
Yeah.
So there's still a lot more work that needs to be done to answer those excellent questions.
Okay, great. Thank you, Amy. I want to get back to the notion of forest conservation for both environmental and food diversity and resilience of food systems issue. And Carol, I think this is a good place for you to jump in. I'm forgetting that I can see you here. Tell us about how that plays out in the very sort of unique geographies where your work is being conducted. So your work is primarily in the Peruvian Amazon. What are you seeing, how are you seeing this diversity play out in that setting? What are the threats? I also would love to hear what the indigenous knowledge that you write and have talked about, how that plays in. What do the indigenous peoples in the Peruvian Amazon area know about this kind of food system diversity and resilience that we could learn from?
Thank you, Kelly. Thank you, everyone. Good morning from La Paz, Bolivia. It's a great pleasure and an honor to be part of this panel. Well, actually, I wanted to mention that the forest is investigating the importance of biodiversity, right? Especially for nutrition, because my background is in human medicine. But at the same time, when I was working, I also realized the importance of biodiversity in general for protecting the land, for protecting not only the humans, but also the other resources, natural resources, animal, plants, because they can live together. So it's not like an agroecological, industrial, very traditional, typical way of producing food, because here in the Amazon, most of the food, the edible biodiversity is generated. So it's not only the production, but also is the food system in indigenous populations is also based on hunting, fishing, collecting foods. So it's not only just going and produce a particular crop. And it's connected with Amy, I think, was mentioned about how our global food system is mostly focused on particular crops, when actually we see the indigenous knowledge system that is connected with their food system. The food system is producing more than 100 species. In my one particular work that I am conducting with the Shawe indigenous people in the Amazon is that we have documented more than 160 species that they have consumed in a 24-hour recall. As Amy mentioned, it's also true that we don't have all the information about the nutrient content. That's another challenge to understand how biodiversity is contributing with the nutrition I have. So that's one part. The second part of my answer is that in my current work as a co-chair of Indigenous People Observatory Network, we're working with colleagues across the world. And for example, it's not only the forest, it's also the ocean, the mountains. So the biodiversity is present all over the region, the ecological systems. Here, for example, in Bolivia, where I live, I see how these extreme events are affecting the glaciers, the mountains. So through the loss of water in the glaciers, we're going to also affect the production of food. So climate change is having different connections across the world, and also in the marine system. Also the foods that are in marine system is going to affect people in different parts of the world. And finally, I want to mention that this is for my peers in the health sector, or my peers who are health professionals. The consequences of climate change and the food systems will be seen primarily for us, because at the end we're going to be called to solve as in the past. So climate change is actually overimposing new challenges and multiplying the challenges that we have observed in the past with health inequities. Now we're going to see more of those because of natural resources that are also being affected by climate change. Thank you.
Thank you, Carol. So yes, I think in some ways the impact of climate on food systems that you've just described is obvious and probably across the board. But I love what you described about the hunting, the fishing, the gathering being a culturally ingrained set of behaviors that are harmonious with these kinds of food systems, which arguably might be more sustainable in the long run. I'm hoping that, Taylor, you can pick up on that a little bit, although maybe a contrast. I know that your work is really, well, correct me if I'm wrong, but a lot of it is sort of emergency oriented and, addressing the very real challenges of undernutrition in certain situations or certain contexts. How does that fit with the notion of culturally relevant food systems and diets?
Yeah. Hi, everyone. And firstly, thank you to the organizing team for really putting food front and center on the agenda on day one. And thanks, everyone, for sticking around to the last session of the day. So my work that I do through my own small nonprofit and then inside some of the bigger food system institutions like UNICEF and the World Bank and the World Food Program, we're focused on looking at, how taking a really human-centered approach to food systems and asking the question, how are families, both in emergency settings and non-emergency settings, how are families living their lives today? How are mothers spending their time? How do mothers want to spend their time? And then how do we design nutritious food products to align with, cultural norms, but also cultural trends as they evolve in 2024? So if a mom doesn't want to be spending all of her time making fresh food at home, complex recipes, or maybe not even so complex, but cooking at home, if a mom is, say, out in a market or out on a farm, how do you design foods that are conscious of time poverty, foods that are convenient, foods that are affordable, foods that taste really good? For anyone who had the chocolate cake at lunch today, we all don't always eat based on health and nutrition. I don't always eat based on health and nutrition. And so how do we design food, for all these, complex factors? And so, in the context of my work, just over the last month, I've been in Haiti and Somalia, two very different contexts where climate change is having massive impact, both in the increasing rates of tropical storms, and then, of course, with drought and the impact on pastoralist communities in Somalia and how that's led to mass displacement of communities. And within the thing that gets me really optimistic in food is that even low-income households, they are spending a large percentage of their household income on food. And so we try to look at food practices and to Amy's point on, these three crops that dominate our food system today. For me as an anthropologist, I try to look at, before colonization, what were the foods and what were the resiliency strategies that certain places utilized. So for example, in Congo, where we work with the World Food Program, before plastic, people packaged their food in banana leaves. And so in Congo, we've built a business model employing 160 female entrepreneurs who produce a product that was first created in Congo in the 1800s. It's called Mampala Pinda. It's basically a Congolese-style protein bar, long before commercial protein bars existed, but made with cassava, peanut, chili, small fish. And it's commercialized in Congo now by these 160 entrepreneurs, purchased by the UN for emergency programs, but also available in local markets. So I think the combination of how do you design both, yes, for emergencies, but also for the fact that households are purchasing food every day, and often, even in emergency settings impacted by climate, food is still being purchased and consumed, and people are still trying to follow their traditional cultural practices. And I think for anyone who's following what's going on in Palestine right now, the celebrations around Eid that have been happening over the last few days are a good example that even in emergency settings, people still try to maintain their cultural traditions, and food is a big part of that.
Great, thank you. Thank you for the example of that protein bar. Because actually I was thinking of ready-to-use therapeutic foods and having a really hard time thinking of those as culturally relevant in many places, and yet incredibly useful and essential when they're needed. But here's an example of something that seems more sort of homegrown and yet is being used by the UN in emergency situations and is creating a small enterprise for the people that are involved. So that's really cool to hear about. So I think we've got a few more minutes before we turn and take a couple questions from anyone here. I meant to remind everyone that's participating online, especially because now we're in the afternoon, we're in the morning in a lot of places that we have registered participants, to go ahead and submit questions. Don't wait until we queue you. You can submit them through the app, and we'll be choosing from among those questions. But first, I want to kind of do a little lightning round with one question, and hope I can rely on you all to keep your answers to about 1 minute, which I imagine is going to be agonizing because this isn't an easy question. But we've heard all these great examples of locations, cultures, geographies, examples of where it's working, where more sustainable, resilient food systems are culturally relevant, are producing the nutrients needed, are more and are good for the environment as well. But we also heard about the fact, I can't remember the number, you'll fill it in, Oliver, for me, but the percentage of total food production that are dominated in these three major grains. And we know that those crops, not everywhere, but in some parts of the world, are heavily industrialized, heavily profitable in some instances, and actually have to be big to be profitable, right? So there's this huge market force that is reinforcing this lack of biodiversity in our food systems. What are the main obstacles to getting around that and to scaling some of these more healthier, sustainable, locally relevant food systems? And who do we need to do what? So I guess the question is, what's the biggest obstacle to scaling sustainable and biodiverse food sources that have that double benefit that Oliver talked about? And who are the policymakers that we need to convince to take an action to help? So Oliver, you start.
Yeah, well, it's an easy question. So I think the first point that I've made already quite a bit is about better integration in policies and strategies and programs. And I do think that looking across all of the different ministries and departments and agencies and sectors to include all of the right actors is a really important starting point. But as it was a big question, let me give the other part of a big answer. I think one of the issues at the moment is that often the economics of food systems pull us in a different direction from the sort of sustainable development goals, right? The kind of objectives we have around climate, around environment, and around nutrition and health and other socioeconomic factors. And so if you look at reports like there's a famous report on the true cost of food, the FAO's State of Food Insecurity in the World report in 2022, I think, looked at the sort of costs associated with the food system, and more recently a report by the Food Systems Economics Commission did the same. We know that in the long term, the food system is costing us more than it is making us. the cost to health, the cost to the environment are costing us literally billions of dollars, even trillions, over the course of the next years. And so what I think we need to focus on is the way that we can reorientate some of those incentives within the system. People will talk a lot about agricultural subsidies, but I would talk also about finding ways to value in those health outcomes, nature outcomes, so that when we're making decisions as the businesses, the private sector, whether that's a farmer or Unilever within the food system, we're making those decisions based on a wider range of outcomes than just the straight commercial and economic outcomes. So sorry, big answer to a big question, but I hope that gives us something to think about.
That's a great answer. Thank you, Oliver. Amy.
So I'm going to follow up and maybe talk a little bit more about one of the points that Oliver made about agricultural subsidies. So the subsidies for particular crops, but also for fertilizers, which also have the climate impact, as well as most of those are incentivized. In some countries, you get fertilizer subsidy for growing maize. And so it's kind of like a double whammy in terms of distorting the food system. Most of the research and development that's been done since the Green Revolution, like all research and investment from the public sector, has gone towards these crops, which is in part why they've been so successful. So I think from like leaving the private sector aside, just the public sector, I think needs to reorient and make what's the word? Not flat playing field, but thank you. Even playing field? No. Level playing field for other foods, other tree-based foods. That's just an example because that's close to my heart because of the double win. But other fruits, vegetables, like I said before, pulses are super important, and nuts. There's issues with the Eat Lancet reference diet, and I have some problems with it, but I think the main point is still relevant, that we need to reorient our diets, but in order to do that, we also need to reorient production.
Okay, Taylor?
Yeah, so one big challenge that I face in my work is that unfortunately there's a lot of industry influence over the policies and the guidelines that are designed. So for example, the World Health Organization has complementary feeding guidelines that came out in October 2023. To create those guidelines, the World Health Organization looked at 50 studies funded by the largest industrialized meat, egg, and dairy companies. And they looked at 0 studies on the role of beans, nuts, and seeds. Beans, nuts, and seeds, 0 studies. Industrialized meat, 50 studies. And so their guidelines for what children are supposed to eat, of course, animal source foods every single day are required or else you'll be malnourished. And beans, nuts, and seeds, not important for kids. And so UNICEF and all these other large organizations, are seeing these WHO guidelines and are using those guidelines. So to Amy's point, how do we create a level playing field where the industry influence is, we're calling it out? And then just quickly on, the question on like what gives me kind of excitement and how do we kind of scale these systems? I think the Congo example is one where we don't necessarily need to scale up to create sustainable food systems, but we can also scale out. How do you create micro businesses doing things at scale, producing thousands of meals every day? But doing it at the community level where you can maybe design off-the-grid systems and you don't need large-scale equipment in order to produce large amounts of quality food.
I love it. Thank you, Taylor. Carol?
Thank you. So my call will be to researchers, especially in the North and people in the global North. And why it is because we know that in other forums we have repeated the indigenous people are protecting 80% of the biodiversity and they are located in around of 20% or 30% of the Earth's surface, okay? So what happened with the other 80% of the Earth's surface? There are other populations, there are other people who are also dominating the global food system. So we need to work together. We are doing our part here in the South. Indigenous people are doing their part. They have the knowledge, they have the species. We need more information about the nutrient content of the food, but also we need the support of the global north to actually provide the solutions. And so that will be my goal from this part. Thank you.
Thank you. So I heard we need neutral, independent, objective research to develop more meaningful guidelines that make sense as a starting point, right? We need to at least make a level playing field, but better yet, create subsidies that are actually directed in the right places for the right things. To do that, we need to properly value and estimate the environmental benefits of a more diverse and sustainable set of food systems, and love the notion of scaling out. And that's really no less overwhelming, but they're different obstacles, right? And that's one that does seem like all of us as advocates can begin to push and disseminate that knowledge and build that demand for those kinds of systems. And then, Carol, to your point, resource them in meaningful ways as well. We may have gone, I'm not sure that this counter is toward 5:30, and we really only have 2 minutes for Q&A, but I'm hoping that we have at least one, and we do. All right, I'll read this out loud. Large animals are often blamed for emitting greenhouse gases, but these animals are a source of food required for child growth, like milk and red meat, and important for food security. Also, in developing countries, smallholder farmers are dependent on livestock for income and livelihoods. What are your thoughts? We didn't talk a lot about livestock, actually. Your thoughts on developing technologies and practice that can reduce the emission from livestock, make the entire system regenerative? Who would like to answer that question? Oliver.
I'm happy to start us off. I mean, we should have anticipated this would be the first question because it's a big and contentious and challenging issue. We have a fairly clear position at GAIN about this, which is that there is currently, there are really three groups at the moment. There is a high consuming group. And obviously there are more high consumers of animal source foods in developed countries, but it's not uniquely the case. There are disparities within countries. And generally, those consumers will need to reduce their intake of animal source foods, partly for health reasons. Sometimes certain types of animal source foods can have negative health impacts, not all of them, and certainly for environmental reasons. And then there's certainly a group, which this question alludes to, of consumers that are consuming far too little in terms of animal source food. They are often children, so they have very small stomachs. Animal source foods can be a very dense source of micronutrients. And also they're people living in places where generally dietary diversity is low, so animal source foods can be a very helpful way of getting nutrients in. And then there's a really large category in the middle of sort of latent demand. People currently not consuming a huge amount of animal source foods, but where consumption is likely to significantly increase. Partly on a per capita basis, that's true. But actually, when you look at the projections, it's not really so much about per capita consumption increasing, it's just about absolute numbers of people. If you look at Nigeria or Pakistan, places where we're going to have hundreds of millions of people over the next 20 or 30 years, consumption will increase of animal source foods. So it's not a universal picture where we should say everyone should go vegan or everybody should cut out this and eat this instead. Overall, we need a reduction. And that is a bit of a challenge at the moment because there is a large amount of pent-up demand. So within that overall picture, certainly to the last point in this question, we're going to need more sustainable production of the animal source foods that we do eat. And that will mean that some of these technologies are important. What I would say is actually the kind of technologies that you often read about in the media, like methane inhibiting feed and so on, for various reasons that we don't have time to go into now, are quite difficult to deliver in the field, are quite difficult to actually get to. Probably the big things are better breeds and better feeds, and just better breeds can often mean that you have far, far more productive animals than some of the animals that we have in some places in the world at the moment. It's a huge topic, happy to talk more about it afterwards, but I hope that's a starting point.
Yeah, maybe just to briefly come in, Oliver and I spent an hour before this session talking about this very subject, so come find us at the reception and we can discuss it further. But just to our earlier point, I think I've been trying to dig into the research at WHO and across the industry, and there honestly is not a level playing field right now. And there is an over-index on the importance of animal source foods and kind of ignoring the role of legumes, ignoring the role of insects in cultures that consume insects, and other forms of kind of alternative protein that are kind of culturally relevant and more traditional foods. So yeah, want to just emphasize that removing the role of industry and organizations like the WHO is really important as we move forward.
Okay. We're over time, but let's just take one more question really quick, but really it'll have to be quick. Bad food lobbies are as terrible as tobacco lobbies. They're often more difficult to counter because of the moral high ground they take on feeding populations and addressing. How do we keep the bad actors? Have I been cut off? How do we keep the bad actors accountable to ensuring nutrition and accountable to environment while encouraging protection and subsidies for sustainable food? So I think this question is, how do we not just circumvent and get around that obstacle, but how do we actually make those players, industry, let's say it's oversimplification, part of the solution? Anybody have a 30-second response to that? Carol, Amy?
No, I don't.
Can I? Can I jump in here? Just for the 30 seconds. Yeah, I think for the industry and all those lobbies, it's important to they themselves reconnect with their own food. So I think it's their people, right? So I think one part of our situation with climate change, of loss of biodiversity crisis, is because we have lost the connection with nature and with our food. We need to relearn about food. So we can go with policies, international policies and agreements that we hopefully will achieve. But if we don't reconnect with our food and with our family and how we eat and drink in our home, we are not going to make probably another big change.
Great, thanks, Carol. So you're really kind of bringing it back down to the community and cultural level, which is maybe part of the solution. We're out of time and over time, Taylor. All right, very quickly.
Companies are run by good people operating in a really bad economic system. And so if you can present to these good people who run companies like Unilever and others, hey, here's a better way to still make money and create a good social impact, people are open to that, I've found.
I couldn't agree more, and it brings open a whole category of thing we should talk about another time, which is the non-state actor engagement with World Health Organization and other UN agencies, and how difficult it is for commercial operations, the good people there, to actually have those conversations. So let's definitely talk about that another time. Let's thank the panelists for a great discussion.